biggest beef against modern versions of intelligent design is that they are science stoppers. They tell us not to bother with research. And I want to give you a very spectacular example of that that also played a role in the trial. This is a drawing of one of the most important proteins in our body, classes of proteins. It's called an antibody. Antibodies are highly specific proteins that enable us to basically aggregate and get rid of viruses, bacteria. If you're immune against smallpox because you were vaccinated, if you're immune against this year's version of the flu because you were vaccinated or you already had it and got over it, you have antibodies against code proteins in the surfaces of those viruses. Those proteins are very, very specific right here in these little red areas. And our bodies have a gene shuffling system that generates this antibody diversity, so you can make antibodies against just about anything. Now, what about this system? Michael Behe, in his book, Darwin's Black Box, knew about it, and he gave this as an example of irreducible complexity. And he says, with respect to this system, we would yearn to know how this magnificent mechanism came to be. Can we look to evolution for the answer? Absolutely not. The complexity of the system dooms all Darwinian explanations to frustration. Sisyphus himself would pity us. I do like the classical reference. He says, why? Because the machine has multiple parts. It's the same argument as clotting or the bacterial flagella. You need all the parts to be get together at the same time. Don't bother to look with evolution. You'll never figure it out by Darwinian mechanisms. Now, he made this claim in 1996. It was a most unfortunate claim because in the succeeding 10 years, literally every element, what is today called the transposon hypothesis for the evolution of this system, has in fact been confirmed. And as a result of a flurry of papers, some of which are shown here, we actually do understand how the antibody-based immune system was produced by gradual evolutionary processes, even to the point of articles in Scientific American explaining this sort of thing for lay audiences. There is in fact a huge literature that has accumulated in just 10 years showing exactly what Professor Behe said Darwinian processes would never ever be able to explain. Now, when this came up in our preparation for trial, I just suggested that they present Dr. Behe with a list of like 70 or 80 papers and see what he does with it. But the lawyer said, wait a minute, Ken, you're the scientist. You give me the bibliography. I'm the lawyer. You leave this to me. So I want to show you what they did. They placed Dr. Behe on the stand, and they gave him that paper, The Descent of the Immune System by Gradual Evolution. They said, Dr. Behe, doesn't this mean that your claim was wrong? He looked at it and said, well, I don't think so. It's not quite the evidence that we... I said, okay, put that aside. Then they gave him a second paper. He said, no, I haven't read that one, but I don't think it. Okay, fine. Then a third paper, and then a fourth paper. And finally, almost 60 peer-reviewed scientific papers documenting the evolution of this system were gradually placed in front of Dr. Behe. Then turns out there's a whole series of textbooks that are now available on the evolution of the immune system. And one at a time, these were placed in front of Dr. Behe. And then finally, medical textbooks on immunology that incorporate the evolution of the immune system as part of the curriculum. Now, to understand this strategy, you have to appreciate the fact that Dr. Behe is not particularly tall. And as this was placed in front of him, and that's the pile, it got larger and larger and larger. Eric Rothschild, the lawyer who cross-examined him, is also not particularly tall. And Eric told me he kept ducking behind the pile. So as Behe said on the witness stand, and the pile got about this high, he had to keep going side to side to maintain eye contact with the attorney. And finally, it got so annoying that Behe turned to the judge and said, Your Honor, can I push this evidence to one side? That was the theatrical moment, and it was theatrical that the attorney was shooting for, and that's part of the skill of the attorney. Did this make an impression with the judge? You bet it did. He wrote, on cross-examination, Behe was questioned about this claim that science would never get an evolutionary explanation for the immune system. He was presented with 58 peer-reviewed papers, 9 books, several textbook chapters. However, he simply insisted this still was not sufficient evidence of evolution, and it wasn't good enough for him. The case was made very clearly that this is a view that exists not because of the evidence, but in spite of the evidence. Now, the other thing that happened, and I want to point this out, although I showed this to people in the seminar this morning, is the fossil record, which is often brought up as a problem for evolution, and this was brought up this way in the trial too, simply backfired on the supporters of intelligent design. They like to argue that the fossil record has no transitional forms, no intermediate forms that would document evolution. Almost 10 years ago, the National Academy of Sciences says that's not true. There are so many intermediate forms between amphibians and reptiles and mammals along the primate line, that sometimes you can't even tell where the transition occurs from one species to another. But in the courtroom, Kevin Padian, a paleontologist from Berkeley, wanted to make this very clear to people. Here's one of Kevin's examples. We've known for a long time that cetaceans, whales and dolphins once again, are descended from land-dwelling mammals. There are lots of marks on that on the oldest fossil whales. But critics of evolution have always said, yeah, if they have been, find the intermediates that would document this transition. And some of them have even gone so far as to say the whole notion of an animal that was intermediate between a land mammal and a swimming mammal is absolutely ridiculous. An animal like that would be a poor swimmer and would be awkward on the land. It could never even have existed. Well, they stopped saying that about a decade ago, when paleontologists dug up the skeletons of organisms that looked suspiciously like the organisms that they said could never have existed. And this is one of those intermediate forms. It's called Ambulocetus natans, which literally means the walking whale who can swim. And Ambulocetus was discovered in the Indus River Valley between India and Pakistan. What paleontologists did then was to flock to that area, and they discovered a lot of other specimens of Ambulocetus, which is a perfectly good intermediate form, but then they discovered another specimen, another species, and then another species, and then another, to the point where today we have a whole series of intermediate forms, that's Ambulocetus right there, documenting the step-by-step evolution of these swimming mammals from their land-dwelling ancestors. Now, how good is this evidence? I presented this slide a couple months ago when I spoke at Yale University, and the person who actually put this artwork together is a wonderful science writer named Carl Zimmer. Carl's in the audience. I attributed it to him. It's from a book called At the Water's Edge. It's a great book. Carl came up to me afterwards and said, Ken, I really like the fact that you attributed the slide to me. Thanks a lot, but it's got a mistake in it. And my heart sank, because I thought, oh my God, what have I done wrong now? He says, the mistake is it's out of date. You said that there were 6 intermediate forms. He handed me a recent scientific review. He says there's not 6, there's actually 23. The fossil record of this has exploded to the point where we now have in even greater detail a record of how these organisms evolved, when they evolved, and what the structural innovations were. So we find this sort of thing literally everywhere. A few people have even suggested that the evolution of whales and dolphins is now so well understood, we should really use it as a poster child. You can see this from a paper for macroevolution, the sort of thing that advocates of intelligent design say has never happened. One of my best buddies, who's got a real penchant for putting things in short sentences, says, Ken, the next time you're involved in a debate with an intelligent design guy or a creationist, make the debate short. Just get up and say the following: we have the fossils, we win. And then sit down, because that's really the state of the fossil evidence. Now, in the trial, I used not fossil evidence, because I'm not a paleontologist, but I used molecular evidence to make very much the same point. 2 weeks before the trial, Nature published the DNA sequence of the chimpanzee genome. Why was that important? It was important, and this is a sentence from the lead article, because more than a century ago, Darwin and Huxley proposed that we have recent common ancestors with the African great apes. Modern molecular studies have spectacularly confirmed this prediction.